So firstly, another very quick reminder of the sections we included in the survey: demographic questions, experiences, attitudes, organisational factors, educators' teaching and learning practices, assessment design, and an open text item. University staff responded to the survey, and the demographic profile of the respondents is outlined there. The gender profile closely resembles that of Australian universities, and across all other demographic categories there was a very good representation, including work location, employment types, years employed in higher education, and employment level. There was also a good spread across discipline areas. Those with large student and staff numbers were unsurprisingly well represented. These are health sciences, education and business, but we were pleased that we got quite good numbers across most, if not all, discipline areas. The first questions we asked staff were about their experiences with a range of cheating behaviours. With regard to outsourced assignments, that is assignments that were completed by someone other than the student who submitted it, 68% of staff reported that they'd suspected seeing this at least once. Of those, 40% suspected this more than 5 times. When we asked staff to indicate what it was that prompted their suspicions, educators' knowledge of the student was the most common signal. 71% reported that in at least one case it was the educator's knowledge of the student's academic ability, and 62% reported that it was language ability that was the signal. Text matching tools continue to be useful, with 49% of the staff reporting these tools signalled their suspicions at one point, but it was an interesting finding for us that it wasn't the primary signal. When asked what the typical response is for cases of outsourced assessment, only 56% of staff refer cases to an AI decision maker. About 8% of staff report that their typical response is actually to ignore outsourced assessment. And the remaining 36% of staff handle it themselves, applying a very broad range of penalties. For the 44% of staff who don't refer cases on to an AI decision maker, we asked them why this was. The most common response was that such cases are impossible to prove. And other responses included reports that the cases are too time-consuming to pursue, or that staff don't feel supported by senior managers to pursue these kinds of issues. We then asked staff who do refer cases onto AI decision makers, how often are these cases substantiated? And when they are, what's the typical outcome for a student outsourcing their work? It was interesting, firstly, that about 1/3 of staff who refer cases on aren't typically informed about further developments in the case. But it was also interesting that a further third report that their cases were substantiated between 90 and 100% of the time. So to some extent, this challenges those perceptions among some staff that contract cheating is impossible to prove, or rather substantiate. But staff need to be better informed about how cases progress if the rates of referral among staff are going to be improved and they feel that the process is working across the institution. And a final question related to outsourced assignments was about the typical penalties applied to such cases. A portion of staff were, of course, not informed of the outcome, but those who could answer were able to select a combination of items, for example, where a student might receive 0 for the task and also be referred to a learning advisor for advice. And the most common outcome reported by staff was a warning or counselling in 30% of cases. Next most common was 0 for the task or a reduced mark. When you look at the academic integrity literature, the sector tends to agree that the most appropriate outcome for cases of outsourced assessment should be suspension. And most universities will tend to say that suspension is their standard response. But suspension was only reported for 3% of cases, and exclusion for only 2. So what this data suggests is that in practice, penalties seem far more lenient than those recommended by the literature or those reported by many universities. I'll address behaviours of exam assistants and exam impersonation a bit more briefly. Only 7% of staff were aware of exam assistants having occurred in their courses, and I say only because in the student survey this was the most common cheating behaviour reported by students, far more common than the outsourcing of assessment. Of those, most had seen it only 1 to 2 times. However, 9% had seen it more than 10 times. As with outsourced assessment, a significant proportion, 23%, were not informed of the penalty. Of those that were, 36% reported that the outcome included 0 for the exam, 46% a warning, counselling, 11% resitting the exam and 4% exclusion. And given the wide-ranging nature of exam assessments, as Tracy said, it could be peaking at a single question, or it could be very well-arranged assessment with an entire exam. It's not surprising the penalties were quite wide-ranging here as well. 5% of staff reported that the more serious breach of exam impersonation had occurred in their courses. And again, most reported seeing it 1 or 2 times, but 13% had seen it more than 10 times. Again, quite a large proportion weren't informed of the outcome. Those who were reported serious outcomes such as suspension or exclusion in only 16 and 12% of cases respectively. And one question to ask here is why more serious outcomes are applied more regularly to cases of exam impersonation than to the outsourcing of assessment. We speculate that this might be because in cases of impersonation there's unequivocal proof, usually, that the breach occurred, but in cases of outsourcing this kind of proof's hard to acquire. And this is why we talk about substantiation rather than proof. And we're suggesting that this is one piece of work the sector might need to do, and we'd like to support it, is developing a strategy for how you substantiate a case of outsourced assessment. A final point to make about these initial survey items relates to whether the 3 cheating behaviours have been recorded in the university's official databases of academic integrity breaches when they're discovered. And staff reported that database records are created in relatively few cases, meaning that students are more able to get away with repeated breaches and probably face no or few penalties. In the next section, we asked staff about their attitudes to our 7 sharing and cheating behaviours with questions that matched the student survey exactly. And Tracy reported that when cheating and non-cheating students were compared, non-cheating students had higher levels of agreement that each of the behaviours was wrong. Perhaps unsurprisingly, on almost every behaviour, staff reported even higher levels of agreement than both student groups that the behaviour was wrong. The only exception was for providing exam assistance, where non-cheating students reported slightly higher levels of agreement that the behaviour was wrong. But I'm not sure that's statistically significant difference. When asked about their perceptions of the prevalence of cheating behaviours in higher education, again in a question mirrored in the student survey, staff were actually far more accurate than students about the numbers of students engaged in these behaviours at university. The highest proportion of staff estimated that between 1 and 10% of students are engaged in these behaviours, which according to available research, including this study, is probably accurate. Of course, students see things a bit differently. Non-cheating student estimates are spread somewhat more evenly across the 1 to 30% ranges. And students in the cheating group tend to think cheating is much more common, with the bulk of their responses spread across the 61 to 90% ranges. One of the more startling findings of the research came when we asked both staff and students how concerned they were that contract cheating was happening in higher education, or that students were engaging in cheating behaviours in higher education. And we provided a 5-point Likert scale ranging from not at all concerned through to extremely concerned. Staff most commonly reported being moderately concerned. However, most of the remaining staff were either very or extremely concerned. When we analysed the student responses, we separated them into those from the cheating and the non-cheating students. Cheating students had almost the reverse profile. The largest group of students reported that they were only slightly concerned about the existence of cheating in higher education, and the next largest group in the cheating subset were not at all concerned. Only 5% of students were extremely concerned. When we looked at responses to this question from non-cheating students, the response profile was almost indistinguishable from that of the cheating group. What this tells us is that although non-cheating students report that cheating is wrong, most don't really mind that other students are cheating. To use a phrase Kath commonly uses, they see it as a victimless crime. It reflects a view that other students are really only cheating themselves when they cheat. And students don't see the public risk inherent in graduating students who aren't competent, and they don't see the reputational risk to their own qualifications in the fact that cheating happens at university. So we suggest also that the sector needs to address this disjuncture, and we plan to develop some resources to support the sector in doing this. We next asked staff about a range of organisational factors, asking them to report their levels of agreement about whether the factors help to minimise third-party cheating. And factors included things like policies and procedures. In terms of positive reporting, staff responses indicated that 3 factors contributed to minimising contract cheating at their institution. These were departmental academic integrity practices, institutional academic integrity policy, and assessment moderation processes. So it seems as if all the work the sector's been doing over the last 5 to 10 years on AI policy and AI practice is having a good effect. At the other end were the more negative responses, where few staff agreed and far more staff disagreed that the factors contributed to minimising contract cheating. These factors were teaching workload, student evaluations of teaching, performance management processes, and class sizes. And these responses perhaps suggest that teaching evaluations and performance management both may serve as disincentives for doing something about contract cheating, while workload and class sizes might be more pragmatic barriers to effectively addressing contract cheating. You might recall that we asked students to indicate their level of agreement with 10 statements about teaching and learning practices at their university. It's small text, don't worry if you can't read it. I'll highlight a few things in a moment. And it was here where a factor analysis that Tracy talked about identified that the cheating group reported a significantly more negative experience on 3 items. That was approachability, understanding assignment requirements, and feedback. Well, we gave staff the same set of items, and we asked them to report the extent to which they agree that they implement these things in their own teaching and learning practice. Of the 10 items, there were 3 in particular on which staff rated their own practice very highly, reporting 96% agreement or strong agreement that the factors are implemented in their teaching. To put that in perspective, the next highest rating staff gave themselves was 88%. So these 3 items sat well above the rest. And the 3 items were precisely those that the cheating group reported more negatively about. So this isn't to suggest that staff are doing a bad job here and they don't realise. But clearly there's a disjuncture between what staff perceive to be a good job here and what students in the cheating group perceive to be a good job. And I think this could be the subject of some very interesting qualitative research that could help us understand this disjuncture between staff and that group of students a bit more deeply. On the subject of assessment design, you might recall that we asked students which type of assessment students would be more likely to consider outsourcing, and students told us about those 4 types. Well, again, we find in the staff survey an interesting parallel to the student survey. We asked staff how often they used the various assessment types in their own teaching, and those they report using most regularly were not those that the students report might minimise outsourcing. They included instead nearly all the features we identified of authentic and programmatic assessment. So staff tend to report that they most commonly institute assessment tasks that have features of authenticity and features of programmatic approaches, such as nested tasks, complex tasks, and real-world tasks. The 4 assessment features identified by students as those they'd be least likely to outsource were reported by over 40% of staff as being used rarely or never. They made up 4 of the 5 least used assessment types. Thankfully, the task type that Tracy suggested the sector should move away from was the least commonly used type of task, which is short turnaround times. So yay. So a final set of questions before the open text item asked staff about their own involvement with contract cheating. So in their role as staff, Only 4 respondents reported ever providing students with materials that would allow them to gain an unfair advantage. This is a very heartening finding, only 4 staff, 0.5%. Staff were then asked whether, as students, they had ever engaged in a behaviour that would be classified as third-party cheating. And 10% said yes. So this finding is pretty consistent with other smaller studies of staff, where staff say around 10%. And coupled with the probability that students are underreporting their engagement in cheating for a variety of reasons, this leads us to believe that actual rates of cheating in higher education are probably closer to 10% than the student survey number of 6%. But at least we can say pretty confidently that they're in that range, somewhere between 5 and 10%.